Hey everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be a little bit of a fun video. We're at a point where preseason will give us a lot of information. More transfers are coming in, but I do think a lot of people have started to set their opinions on what sort of draft they want to have, and their early thoughts might influence how they draft later on as well. So I think it's nice to sort of jump onto some drafts, have a look at the different structures that we have, and thanks to the pricing for this season, I can see a lot of change and variety. Not many picks are nailed on every single player's draft, and I can see a lot of people taking different approaches, and that's sort of the beauty of when the pricing gets done right, and I think it has been done this season. So let's quickly jump into some drafts. The first draft is a Haaland and Salah draft. Now, we've been talking the channel. I've even made a video about a Haaland and Salah draft that I would go with myself, and it's lovely to see that there is still the sort of classic FPL questions, right? Whether you go for a little bit of a strong team that lacks a little bit of rotation, that tries to maximize the points within, your starting 11/12 players, versus, of course, the little bit more popular rotation of recent years, slightly more premium defense. So having a look at the first draft here from FPLCesar, the most interesting thing is you can see that there has been a preference to go for attacking fullback still, and Munoz is almost the replacement for what a lot of people have with the Arsenal defense. And one thing I'll mention is this season, it seems like the attacking fullback might have been nerfed a little bit, right? You can see that a lot of the avenues to reducing bonus points might take away from some of your Trippiers, your Poros, your Trents of the world. And of course, Munoz is one of these players who's quite an attacking fullback, particularly at the end of last season when we saw him play under Glasner. And he was introduced as a key starter and I think had great games closing out the season. Double Crystal Palace defense, I actually really quite like. Ultimately, when you let's say evaluate these early fixtures, and let's say you're going for a Haaland Salah draft, and I think a lot of the logic that people have is early doors. You know that Haaland and Salah have been rested, their minutes should be strong, you maximize on captaincies, you don't have to deal with, for example, someone like Foden or Palmer, who are still involved within the international fixtures as of late. This extends to players as well playing in the Copa America too, and this draft seems to be pretty much shying away from having to deal with that, which I really like. Now, as a little bit of consolation, of course, this draft doesn't really have much of bench depth, right? When you look at the bench, I would say you've got Barco, Stewart, Johnson. Barco could start the season off with a lot of games, which is nice. Stewart, we expect to play considerable minutes within Southampton, and he's, what it seems to be the best 4.5 for now. But I still tend to think when you go into an inflexible structure like this, the issue, I suppose, is what happens if you have, unfortunately, an injury, right? What happens if Salah has an injury? What happens if Haaland has an injury? I suppose for all people who go for Haaland, there's an issue of how quickly will it take for you to replace the player. Now, the simple replacement, if let's say Julian Alvarez stays within the club or another forward gets signed, is you just go for the Man City forward probably of choice, or you go into another premium forward, someone like maybe Watkins, assuming that we all have Isak in our teams. But the issue, I suppose, is if you locked into this structure, how long it will take you to get out of it. And I think part of the help of maybe additional rotation players is you can maybe squeeze through a few more weeks early doors like that. But of course, potentially, envisioning an injury, that is something that we shouldn't do anyways in FPL. But that's just a slight comment about the sort of downside, I suppose, of going with a very inflexible team. I remember last season, as someone who owned a little bit of an inflexible team structure quite like this when Haaland was injured, it took me multiple weeks to get into players, invest more into premium defense, so on and so forth. So there's a bit of a pro and a con both ways. Whereas, in my opinion, if you start with, let's say, a Haaland or Salah only draft, you're probably going to be set in that structure, but you can move a lot of the players around that quite easily. And a lot of players are within similar price points. Whereas if you're stuck here, I suppose the issue is, let's say if you look at someone like Morgan Rogers, there's not too many players you can really move Morgan Rogers to if suddenly he doesn't look like as interesting a pick as he does based on the preseason now, based on the expectation that he will start the season and be a key player for Aston Villa. So those are my only thoughts, and that could very well be, I suppose, the downside to this draft, because you're also relying on not just one differential in terms of the budget position, but also Hudson-Odoi, right? Hudson-Odoi I quite like. We talked about him in the budget differential video. So was Rogers, but when you go into two of these players and you're actually relying on them to quite consistently start, I think that's where I tend to think that maybe with the pricing being so harsh on Haaland this season, that I don't love this draft so much. So because of those aspects, I'd have to say that I'm going to give this draft a 7.5 out of 10. As I said, Munoz I think is very interesting as a pick. Guardiola and Trent, because he's gone so premium defense, there is a little bit of a gap in the midfield. And because of that, I feel like there's a little bit of lost value there. What's fortunate is when Arsenal have better fixtures, you can quite easily move into Saliba from, let's say, Alexander-Arnold, and then that will hopefully give you a little bit of breathing room to move into a structure like this. But I'd probably actually consider starting the season maybe without Haaland. Yes, of course, you miss on the Ipswich captaincy, but you probably have a little bit more of a well-rounded team approaching game week 1, and then you can maybe diversify and find some more value later on. So for example, when Liverpool have worse fixtures, you no longer necessarily need to have Trent, I would say, as a permanent option within your team, and maybe you can have a little bit more of a well-rounded draft. But that's just an initial thought. I do really like Gordon, and I think Gordon is actually just such a good pick to start the season with, so no real complaints otherwise. But yeah, 7.5 for me. Now the next draft is going to be a draft from FPLStatsdan. So StatsDan here is going with the Haaland only structure. So once again, with the theme that we talked about at the start of the video, the pricing seems to have, pushed people into different directions. And it seems like a lot of people have responded to it quite differently. And in my opinion, as I said, you can still find different ways to go for different drafts. I just think there are compromises to each draft. And sometimes as someone who has enjoyed having a little bit more depth than other players in the past, having a little bit more rotation, for example, with that 11 spot in FPL, that 12 spot in FPL, sorry, the 12 or 13 spot in FPL in my drafts, I tend to show a little bit of a preference to that because I feel like that will give you a little bit more breathing room when things go wrong, when injuries happen, things like that. So StatsDan's draft here is starting with a 4-4-2, but it is quite reliant on João Pedro. Now, João Pedro has been removed from the Brighton training camp, but it doesn't seem like the injury is actually severe based on the news reported from a Brighton journalist. I think that it should be short term, and hopefully he'll be back with the team. So he could very well start game week 1 and once again be reinserted back into our draw. So I'm sort of taking João Pedro starting the season to account. Now, with João Pedro, I think a lot of people have seen that, of course, if he starts as a center forward, he's broken as a pick, but it's very likely with players like Unda back, with Ferguson back, that he'll play a different role in the team. Maybe a bit of a 10, maybe taking some minutes even in the right wing position potentially, because he is quite flexible and quite adaptable as a player, which I quite like. This draft here features Hall. And what's nice is with Hall, a lot of people have gone for Burn, but what I can see from Newcastle fans is with the Lloyd Kelly transfer as well, it seems like this might be potentially the end of, a permanent Burn era, right, where he either plays left back or center back. But clearly, I think one thing to say is there's a bit of a difference between what fans say and what Eddie Howe thinks. Eddie Howe clearly has shown a lot of preference for Burn, and Burn has been a huge servant to Eddie Howe, so maybe that's a little bit overblown. So with Hall, I suppose you're reading into it that he's going to get a lot of the left back minutes. I feel like Hall still might not get exactly the minutes we want to start the season. But hopefully the preseason will give us a little bit more information. So I think he's a little bit of a shaky pick there. But I do like the sort of Hall concept rotation. What I will say is that in terms of the 4.5s, when I've had a look at them myself, I tend to think that this season is a little bit going to be taking away from attacking players, right? And so if you're going for 4.5 defenders, you probably still want to try and go for teams that are the best defenses, which mean going back to clean sheets and looking at stats like expected goals conceded or expected goals allowed last season. And Crystal Palace and Everton, for me, are two teams that rotate really well in the early door fixtures, that I prefer them over, let's say, a Konsa and Hall. Now, Konsa, as I've mentioned, also rotates really well with just naturally an Arsenal defender, so I can understand the value of that. And maybe we've picked Hall here as well just to plug in some of the gaps where, as you can see with this week, when you're benching João Pedro, maybe it makes sense to do so. I like Odegaard a lot, and I like Mbeumo too. The only thing I would say is that the Brentford fixtures do feel tough. I know there's a little bit of Mbeumo, João Pedro rotation, but if you're also implying so much rotation, I guess that means that very often you could find yourself playing a 4-4-2 in this FPL season. But you also have Rodgers who can come in as well, right? Rodgers is someone who has a great game in versus West Ham, and then in game weeks 3 plus basically has amazing fixtures. So there's quite a lot of rotations stepped into this team. I probably haven't looked deeply enough into the rotation between, let's say, Rodgers and maybe even the Newcastle defender too much, to be honest. And that could actually maybe change my opinion on it. But I think that Hall just might have slightly shakier minutes, and that's why I think it's a little bit open to a bit of failure. And Mbeumo as well, we think he will actually probably be the penalty taker, but If he doesn't start the season as a penalty taker, I don't really like the idea of Mbeumo, because we also know that Brentford ultimately have some pretty tough fixtures to begin with. And I still think that when you're planning for a team with Game Week 1, you probably want to ensure that that opening run of games is going to be still quite solid for a player, because it's not like Mbeumo is at a price point where he's non-negotiable for me. I think Eze is a little bit like that, maybe Isak a little bit like that, partially because of fixtures too, and Callum Wilson being out, meaning that he's nailed on penalties. Haaland, of course, is what allows this draft to breathe. You're probably going to be captaining Haaland most of the time. The only thing I'd say is probably the tough fixture for Man City is going to be Game Week 5. So I guess the question would be, when it comes to Game Week 5, who becomes your captaincy within the team? Potentially that might be the case where you move Odegaard later on, maybe Mbeumo later on, and you have an option in place of that. But that's the only thing I would say about a Haaland-only draft that I'd like to point out, right? If you think about Salah's fixtures, they're actually really clean Game Weeks 1 to 6. With Haaland, you still have that Arsenal fixture where maybe you want to think about who's your fallback option in that game week. I like, once again, Crystal Palace goalkeeper. You can probably just decide and find out when John Stone or Henderson will become the starting goalkeeper of the season. I really can't imagine that by Game Week 1 we're going to be uncertain about that. So let's just see what happens with that. I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt there, because I've personally also been including Henderson within my drafts, and I don't have any set thoughts on it. I just think Henderson is more than likely going to keep his spot. So that's just something to say. Arsenal defense is very strong. I can see the value of that. And I think this draft, what's nice about it is that it can probably last quite long, because if you keep these Arsenal players in your team and you see them as close to set and forget, this draft can last a long time. You will accumulate a lot of free transfers, and you can accommodate any of the issues that your team props up. Even Mbeumo, for example, when Brentford's fixtures become a little bit easier, you would have eased up by them. But I think the question, of course, is going to be, are you maximizing enough in the short term? And I think Mbeumo might not allow you to achieve that. So because of that, and I do like João Pedro, to be fair, what I will say is that this draft is probably going to be an 8 out of 10 for me. I'm still a little bit Salah leaning right now, and I can completely understand people wanting to go with Haaland, right? The reason for maybe going Haaland only over Salah only, which still gives you, as you can clearly see with this draft, quite a bit of rotation, is just the idea that maybe Haaland is the younger player, that his minutes will be more nailed, and that Salah, of course, with the aging profile, with declining minutes, might not exactly be the best captaincy pick that we all think that he prospectively is looking like. So I can definitely buy into that argument as well. So it kind of, I think my judgment on this draft is a little bit subjective, but it could very well change very quickly in terms of the value between, or the value gap between, Haaland and Salah for those opening games. So we'll see what happens. I'm a little bit more on the side that I think Salah will open the season with very good minutes. So I think I'm a little bit more Salah only leaning. I don't think Haaland only is a problem at all. I think it's just a question of probably if you replaced Mbeumo, someone a little bit more short term, maybe someone like Gordon, if you could maybe squeeze out a little of cash somewhere out of the team if possible, that could work out really well. Or of course you go for another 6.5 who ultimately has really good fixtures to start off with, like someone like Gibbs White, for example, who probably is less of an open play threat compared to Mbeumo, but could be just as interesting just because his fixtures are that good. So the third draft that I'm going to be looking at is going to be FPLnkunku's draft, and this is very interesting, right? He's saying that he's going to go with the bench boost 1 with a wild card 2 to 3 in mind. He'd love to hear my thoughts on that strategy and if I thought of it. Well, I have to say, I have experienced and met a lot of other bench boost winners in the past, and I feel like it often just never goes to plan, because whilst it's appetizing to get into a great position in the world early days, whilst it's interesting, of course, to sort of maximize on some great early fixtures, because what do we tend to say about FPL, right? You have the most information about Game Week 1, and then after that, you kind of have diminishing understanding of what's going to happen, right? You never know. By Game Week 2, you can have 2-3 injuries in your team. By Game Week 2, the transfer window can have huge impacts on your team. But that's kind of why I like to use the wild card, particularly in a season like this where you can roll your free transfers as well, to use it a little bit more as a security blanket right now in terms of my thinking. Yes, of course, I know a lot of people are planning an early wild card, maybe somewhere between Game Weeks 4 and 6 to target the swing of Arsenal fixtures potentially if you're a Game Week 6 wild carder, or Game Week 4 if you're someone who really wants to go Salah, Haaland, maximize the captaincies, move out of that team structure immediately. But with this situation here, I feel like you're playing your hand a little bit too soon. We will still have double game weeks this season as well, and I can't imagine we'd be in a world where necessarily using the bench boost early is going to have great dividends for later in the season. Because what we've noticed in the previous years in FPL, I believe, is due to how rotation is quite beneficial around fixture windows. Like, for example, when we have singles and doubles, you generally want to have a little bit of rotation spliced into the team. And when that happens, you just need a strong bench anyways in FPL. And I don't think too much will change this season, unless, of course, we find ourselves in a position where Salah and Haaland, that team structure, that premium structure becomes optimal. Because if you think about it, if Salah is not so important after the great run of Liverpool fixtures, if Trent is not as important after the great run of fixtures, if you're going Salah only or Haaland only, or you're going for a multitude of these sorts of players where it's Haaland plus, let's say, Saka / Son / Palmer / Foden, I still think you'd have enough money to have a little bit of rotation there, because as you can see with the way pricing has gone, you have access to some pretty strong defenses in Crystal Palace and Everton at a pretty cheap price. And what we can already see from the preseason is that you have some good value players at 5 million, at 5.5, at 6.5 in the midfield position too. And because of that, I tend to think that using the bench boost early is almost predicting that ahead of time later and subsequent bench boost windows could be a lot worse. And for whatever reason, that diminishing the amount of value that your bench would need is going to help the sort of top-sidedness of your team. So, for example, focusing or allowing yourself to focus on the starting 11 and 12. I also think that generally with the wildcard, we want to get as much information from the new season as possible, right? Between game weeks 1 and 4, I still think that's very little time to kind of get an understanding of how far teams have improved compared to our previous expectation from last season. So, for example, Man United is a good team to reflect this, right? They might have a lot of new transfers. Tottenham as well seem to be dipping into the market now. Arsenal are likely as well to get Calafiori into the team and then maybe sign another player or two. Because the transfer window is still going to be open, because you also know that we will probably change our minds on certain teams after they've played certain fixtures, I just think that you won't get enough information on Wildcard 2 to really put yourself that far ahead of the template. Because yes, you might get the information that you want from Game Week 1, but if you Wildcard 2, Wildcard 3, you lose the opportunity of getting a little bit more information down the line and maybe wildcarding a little bit later as well. Because I think the beauty of the wildcard is when it's not so important this season, you want to use it, as I said, as a little bit of a security blanket if possible, and not sort of throw in all your chips early doors and leave yourself without, I guess, armor to cover yourself. Because I think, and I spoke to Praz about this as well, he made a very good point where, yes, of course, we've had changes to the way transfers work, but you still get the same amount of free transfers this season. So if your team runs into issues, you're still going to have the same amount of transfers as you would in any other season. And as we tend to know in FPL, things can unravel very quickly with your team. So going for a strategy like this is something I'd probably not go for. But let's address the team at hand, right? You've got Martinez with the home fixture. Let's just count the amount of home fixtures, right? You've got Burn, potentially he might play or he might not play. Martinez, Wood, Sells, all great fixtures. Wood especially, I believe, since you really would think that he starts the season with a great fixture here and it's not an issue. Hudson-Odoi, same thing here. With Liverpool, all these players play Ipswich, so that's quite nice. Eze, Gordon, Isak, amazing fixtures, and same with Arsenal as well with Wolves at home. And so with Porro also at Leicester away, I think you can't really do any worse than that. So I think the team itself is amazing, but whether the punt is worthwhile by the time, let's say, you reach game week 20 in the season, I'm not so sure about that. So I would tentatively say that I'd probably swerve the strategy. I like the draft and I like the concept of it, but I think that there's a huge opportunity cost. And I think I myself learned a lesson last season too. When I went for, let's say, a game week 26 wildcard, you can say it was a little bit overly ambitious and I set myself up to fail later down the line, which I just don't want to see the same happen to you. Although I did, as I said, get very lucky at the end of the season. So who knows? That's how FPL works sometimes, ups and downs. So I'd probably rate this draft, I'd rate this draft honestly a 9, probably 9 out of 10 for the purpose, right? But the idea, the chip strategy logic, I'm gonna have to say that it's for me it's a 2 out of 10. I'd avoid it for sure. But will it separate you from the rest of the pack? 100%. Could it leave you in a position where you're suddenly behind the rest of the pack very, very quickly? Also yes, and that's why I don't really love it. As far as the last draft here, we're looking at FPL HM10's draft. FPL HM10 draft, once again, is a super different draft. And this draft has no Salah and no Haaland as well. So, I mean, not many people I've seen so far have actually attempted this type of draft. So that makes it more interesting for me to cover it. HM10, I think, also finished within the top 200 last season. So clearly someone who knows what they're doing. I like this draft in terms of all the players that are in it. I think the immediate concern when I think about no Salah, no Haaland is, do we lose out a little bit of the value on the captaincies, right? Yes, whilst Foden, Palmer, Son are all amazing, some of these players even outscored both Haaland and Salah last season. I would still say, given that I'm a bit of a betting man, with Liverpool's opening fixtures to start off with let's say Haaland as well on Ipswich game week 2, not having either, in my opinion, does definitely lose you out on a few captaincy points. But the difference making potential of this draft is going to be, does basically having the Thanos Infinity Gauntlet with no premiums make up for it? So, e.g., do the non-captaincy points make up for it entirely? And I think, look, we've seen Foden hat-tricks in the past, we've seen Palmer hat-tricks in the past, we've seen Son hat-tricks in the past. So I think it's so interesting going with this draft. And when I tend to think about the early captaincies, so Isak game week 2 makes a lot of sense. On game week 2, it's probably a Foden captaincy. On game week 3, it could be anyone. It could be anyone, really. It could be Palmer. Potentially even game week 2 could have been a Son captaincy as well, right? That's Everton at home versus Foden, who of course has Ipswich. I'd probably lean Foden right now. Game week 3, as I said, that could be Palmer. Game week 4, that's actually, once again, a little bit open. Game week 5, I think, is where there might be a small issue, but you have transfers to sort of accommodate for that. What I will say is that game week 5 is a really good Liverpool week. And when I tend to look at, for example, Salah only versus Haaland only, that's the one sort of fixture that I think sticks out a little bit more. Although you can say that, once again, there's a huge gap between, let's say, Haaland versus Salah in game week 2. So I think that's a fair point to make entirely. So as I said, I think captaincy is lost out a little bit there. Maybe the game week 5 captaincy could be a touch weak, but you can probably also remodel your team entirely by game week 5 with the free transfers that you'd have by then. So maybe I would be wrong. I do like João Pedro, of course. We know that he could maybe have to be replaced by someone else. The draft is a little bit light, in my opinion, in terms of the rotatable aspect of it. If you, let's say, go for João Pedro, because you're also assuming that he has to get a lot of starts, and perma playing João Pedro isn't something I love too much. And I think Mykolenko and Anderson rotate really well with each other. But you also have actually Arsenal defense, which I think, once again, in terms of players who don't really need to be transferred out, right? Raya is a perfect example of that. So this draft can last an extremely long time. And with the more free transfers you accumulate, you can solve issues with the team as soon as it props up. I suppose the counter position is it tough to get into a Salah? Is it tough to get into Haaland? Maybe. But I think, as we said in FPL, it's not about necessarily just immediately changing things up to follow what team did well in the previous week. It's just about, are you ready to take on the opportunity cost of not having all these other players? And if you're doing so and you're comfortable taking that risk, that's fine. So I actually really applaud this draft here. As I said, a little bit light on the bench, in my opinion, and I think it does force for João Pedro to be extremely, effective week on week to get the maximum value out of this draft. And I think because of that dependency, I'll also probably give this draft 7.5. I think we've seen a lot of strong drafts, and as I said, some of it will be very outcome dependent. We will have a huge Haaland captaincy haul potential in game week 2, but we've also seen in the past when Haaland has perfect fixtures that it doesn't go to plan. If you guys remember last season, when he played Luton in the Cup, for example, he had an amazing fixture, scored 5 goals. When he had Luton in the league, it wasn't exactly quite as good. His best matchup was Wolves, who are unfortunately also quite a poor defense, and it shows you, of course, the ceiling really of Haaland. But a lot of the, I suppose, early outcomes are going to be depending on these captaincy holes, or of course, if you have, let's say, the Watkins, where a lot of people don't seem to have Watkins on their draft, or if you have Son, for example, someone who's also, for example, in HM10's draft, not on a lot of people's drafts. These players can go absolutely nuclear, and I love the fact that our pricing has allowed for this season. So really, really strong drafts, in my opinion, showed up in this video. So thank you guys for sending your drafts. If you guys feel like your drafts are quite similar, or you enjoyed some of the thoughts, let me know. If you disagree with my opinion, that's fine as well. We can discuss that. I'm actually planning to make a video on the value of premium defenders, because I feel, whilst of course we've had some bonus changes that negatively impact defenders, in my opinion, the premium defenders have not really been severely impacted compared to slightly less worse, or rather more worse slightly worse defensive options. And I'd like to make a video on that. Let me know if you would be curious to see a video that maybe reflects on the value of the premium defender. That's something I think will take a little bit of time, take a little bit of digging into the data, but I'm happy to do so. And otherwise, thank you guys so much for watching the video. See you guys soon. Take care and goodbye.